Okay guys, this is the new incubator. It's about twice as big as my previous incubator and it is brand new. It's a drinks cooler and still is completely intact. I have an additional requirement in this build in that I do not want to lose the functionality of the drinks cabinet. I want to be able to convert it back to a drinks cabinet at any time, so I am not going to modify it. In the bottom we have the compressor and all the cooler equipment which is still in place. In the top we have a fan and a light switch, and the good news is when I switch this on I have a temperature control here which I can actually turn off the compressor, so I get no cooling. But I do have the light switch and I do have the fan, which is absolutely awesome. Without having to do anything else, I have some of the functionality that I may need. Now, I also bought myself a thermometer, a digital thermometer, and you'll see that the temperature is 29.4, which is 85 Fahrenheit. That is ambient with no heat added at all. So I'm already at 85 Fahrenheit. My incubator needs to be at 89 Fahrenheit, so I do not actually need to add a great deal of heat. So I bought myself a bunch of accessories. Here I have the inevitable extension cable for plugging it in when I get it into position. I have a USB extender cable because I did buy a USB fan. I did some experimentation with the fan here, and with no heat added but just the fan on continuously with the door closed obviously, the incubator warms up to 94 Fahrenheit. This fan is a source of heat and it is too hot for me to be able to use that fan on a continuous basis. The fan does give a even temperature throughout, but it's an even 94, which is much too high, so I did get myself a USB fan. We probably will not be able to use this fan. Why do I not just connect this fan up to the thermostat and use that as my heat source? It's because when the fan first switches on it's cold and it takes a long time to warm up, so I don't have enough control using this fan as the heat source. It needs to be on for a couple of hours before it warms up and starts to add heat to the incubator, so I cannot use that as a heat source. I also can't use it as the fan because when it does get warm it warms the incubator up to too hot. So I've got this little USB fan here, and again I've done a little experiment with it, shoved in at the bottom, run continuously, and despite the fact that the guy assured me that this USB fan does not add heat, it does. All fans have an electric motor, and no matter how small the fan, no matter how small the wattage on the fan, they are a source of heat. But fortunately this fan only warms the incubator up to about 87 Fahrenheit, so I'm still short of the temperature that I need for incubation, so I will be able to use this fan if I need it. I also have a heat gun. This is essential for doing some of the checks that we're going to do on the incubator and as I build it. And an essential part of this build is a new thermostat. This is a pulse proportional thermostat from Habistat in the UK, 3-prong plug, 240 volts. Unlike the American stuff, so we can plug it straight in here in Malaysia. And I'm going to use heat cable rather than a heat mat. I've got 7 meters of heat cable and it's 50 watt. The thermostat is a 600 watt, so I have plenty of surplus power. So I'm going to use this pulse proportional thermostat, this heat cable. I'm going to attach heat cable to the bottom of the lowest tray in the incubator, and I can tape it to the side and out to the thermostat on the floor, and it will run through the door seal without having to modify the chiller in any way. I can run the cable. So let's take a look at the thermostat. Here is the thermostat, and it has a dial control. It's actually a very simple thermostat, very easy to use. You just set your temperature on here. There is a temperature sensor that goes inside the incubator. This is the power outlet for the heat cable to go into, and because this is a pulse proportional thermostat, all thermostats are actually fairly simple. They switch the current on and they switch the current off. An on-off thermostat will have a temperature, a desired temperature, and it will switch on if the temperature drops a certain amount below that temperature, and switch off when the temperature rises a certain amount above that temperature, usually about a 1 degree C window. This functions quite differently. You set the desired temperature and this sends pulses of on-off switches to the heat cable at a certain frequency depending upon how much heat is required. By sending pulses of on-off switches to the heat cable, it actually keeps the heat cable warm instead of it switching on and off. And because I only need to add about 5 Fahrenheit to the incubator, a pulse proportional thermostat will give me a much greater degree of control. And of course this is the plug that goes into the mains. So we plug this into the mains, that into the heat cable, and the heat sensor goes in the middle. I'll tape it to the middle shelf. I want the temperature reading to be in the middle. So this is the heat cable, 7 meters of heat cable. It's probably more than I actually need. We'll just unravel that. And what I'm going to do with this is the heating element that's going to be used to heat the incubator. I'm going to wrap this around this shelf here. So let me get on and do that, and we'll be back in a second. Okay, so I've got the heat tape all taped up the bottom rack, and they're just zip tied in. So very easy to remove for maintenance if it's required. So that just slides in to the bottom rung. Like so. I've already got my probe for the thermostat rigged up to the middle, and I just need to plug that into the socket from the Habistat thermostat, and it is providing heat to the heat cables, so these should now warm up. So while we're here, let me just talk a little bit about how heat is actually transmitted to the incubator. There are 3 types of transmission of heat. There's radiation, there's conduction, and there's convection. We don't have a lot of heat cable in here, and I can assure you that the radiation from that is minimal. Conduction is when heat is transmitted via direct contact. So if you put a pan on the stove and you apply heat to the bottom of the pan handle gets hot, and that's conduction. Conduction is very fast and very efficient. Radiation loses quite a bit of energy in the process. The other process that heat is transmitted by is convection, and you've probably heard of convection currents. And what's going to happen in our incubator here is the air that's in contact with this heat cable will warm up by conduction because it's touching, and as the air warms up it becomes less dense and rises up to the top of the incubator. The cool air flows down to the bottom, and that's convection. What that means is that when I close this, the heat from these heat cables now will cause a convection current of warm air to rise to the top, and cool air will sink to the bottom. Now I'm not adding very much heat, but this incubator is actually quite tall, much taller than the other incubator. The other incubator that I had did not have any stratification. There was no temperature difference between top and bottom. And I'm not sure that we're going to get a temperature difference in this incubator. If it was tall enough, there definitely would be one, because convection is the main process by which heat is going to be transmitted and kept inside this incubator. So what I'm going to do to help that process is, on the bottom shelf here, I'm going to put some water bottles. And you'll see that these water bottles here are actually in direct contact with the heat cable. By conduction, heat will be transmitted to these water bottles. What that will do is provide a much larger surface area. So what will happen now is by conduction, heat will be transmitted to these water bottles, and these water bottles will also warm up to the desired temperature that I set on the Thermostat. So that will increase the surface area for the air that's in contact with the warm surface. That will increase the convection current, warm air rising to the top, cool air sinking to the bottom. So what we're going to do now is we're going to leave this for 24 hours with the Thermostat, and I will play around with the Thermostat to try to get the temperature a stable 89 degrees at this probe. Then I will get a temperature reading at the bottom and a temperature reading at the top using my heat gun and using this stat. It does have a maximum and minimum, so we'll reset that. It's reading 29.7. We need to get that up to about 31.6 to 32, and it needs to be constant from top to bottom. So we're going to play around with this over the next 24 hours to see whether this is working adequately. I can take temperatures with my heat gun. 88 at the bottom, 87.5 at the top, so the heat cable is actually already starting to warm things up in there. So we'll just close this. And notice that the cables here will simply be held in place by the seal, so I don't even need to modify the seal. See at the bottom here, these cables come straight through the seal here. So again, it's just a question of removing those to regain the functionality of the chiller. Okay, so what I'm going to do with these trials is also I'm going to put an egg box on each of the 4 shelves. One on the top shelf, one on the middle shelf, and one on the bottom, so that when the incubator is stable, I can get a temperature reading on the bottom, I can get a temperature reading on the top, and find out whether there's a heat gradient. Now remember that it's convection that's causing that heat gradient. There is actually air moving, warm air moving up to the top and cool air moving down to the bottom. So if I find, after playing with this incubator, that I'm getting too much stratification and I'm getting a temperature gradient between the hot air at the top and the cooler air at the bottom, I will install a fan. And what that fan will do is to produce my own convection current that actually disrupts that temperature gradient. So I will cause turbulence in the air, which will enable mixing of the warm air with the cold air and prevent that stratification. So if I need that, I will introduce that after I've figured out how this incubator is running. So we'll do that as the next step if I need to. Just remember with the fan that the fan itself is always a source of heat. For me in the tropics, that heat input is actually significant, and I will probably have to reset my thermostat in order to account for that heat, which means that you set your incubator up either with or without a fan, and the fan must be running all the time when you set your incubator up. You cannot have your fan running on the thermostat where it's switching on and off, because you disrupt the convection currents and you get a false reading inside your incubator. So we'll determine first of all what the temperature gradient is in this incubator without a fan. If I get too much stratification, I'll put a fan in. We'll turn the fan on and it will be on permanently for the life of the incubator, and I will readjust my thermostat to get the optimum temperature setting. So we'll come back in about 24 hours and I'll let you know how that goes. Okay, so here we are 24 hours later, and the temperature of the incubator has been just nice for the last 24 hours, which shows that we have enough heat in the system. The thermostat is able to maintain temperature, and if we have a look at the temperature, it is 89 on the bottom, it is 89.5 on the second, 89 on the third, and 88.5 at the top. So what's happening here in the incubator is we've got a nice little bit of radiation heat in this local area here. The water bottles have warmed up to 89.5, exactly where they should be. So we're also conducting heat into the water bottles. So these are acting as a heat sink. They're preventing temperature spikes in the incubator, and they're also nice and warm, so we very quickly get the temperature back up to what it needs to be. Now, we know that radiation is occurring here, and we're conducting heat into the stuff that's touching the heat cables, but we know that air does not conduct heat very well. In fact, we use air as an insulator in our clothing. We know it keeps us warm, so we're not conducting heat up to the top of the incubator. The only way that the heat can get up to the top of the incubator is via convection currents, and I think what's happening here is that we're getting a nice bit of convection in the top 2/3 of the incubator, so we're getting some circulation here, but we've got a little bit of a dead zone at the top. It's a little bit cooler at the top, so the convection currents are not actually making it all the way to the top. They're actually circulating in this part of the incubator here, and we've got this dead zone here. Now, it's not too bad. This temperature is still okay, so as a fail-safe we could use it as is, but I would like to get a more constant temperature. So what I'm going to do is to experiment a little more with a fan at the bottom, and what that fan is going to do is to put my own convection current in, and hopefully we'll be able to clear this dead zone at the top. So we're going to put the fan in for another 24 hours and see if that makes a difference to the temperature gradient that we're seeing in here. I'm already fairly happy with the way the incubator is working. I'd just like to clear this dead zone at the top. So we'll come back in about 24 hours after I've put the fan in, and we'll have a look and see what difference that made. Okay, so over the last 24 hours I have tried the incubator with the fan at the bottom pointing up, with the fan at the top pointing down, and with the fan at the top pointing up. And the best solution over the last 24 hours has been the fan at the top pointing up. So if I just take my heat gun here now and get readings at the top, 88.5, 88.5, 89, 89. So I have a half a degree difference from the bottom to the top, and I'm happy with that. That appears to be the solution. You'll see that I've already put the thermostat to the front of the case just to tidy it up. The next step in the process is to move this incubator into the space that it's going to live in, because the airflow in that space might be different to the airflow around here. But over the last couple of days of playing with this incubator, I've learned a lot about the incubator and the equipment itself. I know that the thermostat is extremely sensitive, and a tiny little change to this dial here makes quite a big difference to the temperature in the incubator. I know that I have a dead space at the top, so I need to have a fan, and the best solution is a fan at the top pointing up just to disrupt this dead space, and then I get a very even temperature throughout the incubator. I know that if my fan fails, the incubator from this point down is still giving me a very stable temperature. It's only the top that's the dead zone. So I've learned that about my incubator, and what that does is give me the confidence that this incubator is now running stable enough, and that I don't need to mess with it now in order to get it running satisfactorily. I have the confidence in this incubator that it is going to do the job for me, and I don't need to make drastic changes. If I do make a change, I understand what I'm changing, what I expect to happen, and I know what the sensitivities are. So I've developed that confidence over the last couple of days in the incubator that I'm not going to have to mess with it when the eggs go in. Now, I have 2 heat guns and I have a thermometer in the incubator here, and you'll see the thermometer is reading 30.3 centigrade, and the temperature inside is actually a lot closer to 32 centigrade. So this is not giving me an accurate reading. And I also have 2 heat guns, both of which give me a different temperature reading. So how do I know which one is actually correct? How do I calibrate which of these pieces of equipment is correct? Well, over the course of this pandemic, one of the things that is required by law in Malaysia now is that every single shop has a temperature gauge on it. When I go shopping, I have to take my temperature. So I know that my temperature is 36.34, the low 36s, and most households now in Malaysia will have one of these. This is how your doctor takes the temperature, and this goes into your ear. So I'll just take my temperature right now, and my temperature is 36 degrees. That temperature is very, very close to what I actually need in my incubator, and it's a perfect temperature for calibrating my heat gun. So if I heat gun myself, this heat gun is reading 36 degrees. This heat gun is accurate. So I know if I use this heat gun and get a reading of 88.5 Fahrenheit in here, that it is actually 88.5 Fahrenheit. So I can ignore this temperature reading here, except that I know that 30.3, 30.4 on this temperature gauge here is where the incubator needs to be. So whilst it's not actually giving me an accurate absolute reading, it is going to give me an idea of when the incubator is too warm. So I can still use this, but I have to recognize that it's not actually very accurate. If I use this heat gun and shoot my temperature, this heat gun is only reading 35 instead of 36, so this one is actually 1 degree centigrade out as well. So between the 3 of these, this heat gun, and this thermometer here, I have a 2 degree centigrade difference in temperature, and I know that this heat gun is accurate because I've calibrated it against my own body temperature. I know what my body temperature is. I've just taken my temperature on this very sensitive temperature gauge here, and that's corroborated by every single shop that I go into in Malaysia that tells me what my body temperature is. So this is the gun that I need to use. .5, 89, 89, 89.5. So a half a degree Fahrenheit difference between the top and the bottom. So what I'm going to do is to move this into place. I'm going to tidy up all these cables when everything is in the final position that it's going to be in, and I'm not happy with the fan still. That fan was perfectly fine on the bottom. It occupies a lot of space. It's not very good at the top. It's occupying a space that an egg box could be in, and because I now know that I need a fan at the top and it needs to be pointing upwards, I will actually replace that fan with a smaller fan so that I can utilize this space for an egg box. So that will be one small tweak that I make. And I'm also going to put an egg box into the bottom tray here and find out what temperature that bottom tray runs at too, so that I can utilize this space for extra egg boxes if I need the additional space. So I'll come back to you with a photo when that's all in place, but basically over the last couple of days I've got familiar with my equipment, I've got familiar with my incubator, and I know what each of the tweaks does when I adjust something on the incubator. So I'm confident that this incubator is now going to do the job for me, and it's set up perfectly.